Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, an unrehearsed panel discussion of the U.S. government's wars and the racism they inspire. Our program is presented by members and friends of AWARE, a local peace group. AWARE is an acronym for Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. AWARE was established 14 years ago after the attacks of 9/11-2001 by citizens of Champaign-Urbana who realized that the U.S. government would use those crimes to justify its already long-standing attempts to exercise military control over the Middle East and its energy resources. The U.S. doesn't need oil from the Mideast, but Mideast gas and oil are needed by America's economic competitors in Europe and Asia, and so control over them gives the U.S. a major advantage over China, Germany, and other countries, which benefits only the American 1%. Although that was the real reason, the Bush and Obama administrations launched wars in the Mideast and killed well over a million people with a propagandistic claim that they were fighting terrorism. But after all, what is that? There are, in fact, official definitions of terrorism in U.S. and British law and in U.S. Army manuals, and they're all about the same. To take one succinct official definition, terrorism is, quote, the calculated use of violence or threat of violence to attain goals that are political, religious, or ideological in nature through intimidation, coercion, or instilling fear, close quote. In other words, the military operations themselves of the Bush and Obama administrations were not only contrary to international law, but they fall under their own definitions of terrorism. In fact, state-directed international terrorism in the technical sense of U.S. and British law. For exactly that reason, the official definitions are unusable by our government. They fail to make a crucial distinction. The concept of terrorism must somehow be crafted to include foreigners' terrorism against us while excluding our terrorism against them, which is often far more extreme. To devise such a definition is a challenging task. Accordingly, from the 1980s, there have been many scholarly conferences, academic publications, and international symposia devoted to the task of defining terrorism. But in public discourse and in the media, the problem does not arise. Well-educated Americans have internalized a special sense of terrorism required for justification of U.S. state action and control of the domestic population, and departure from that canon is generally ignored or, if noticed, elicits impressive tantrums in the media. But it becomes clear that Noam Chomsky is correct when he says, everyone's worried about stopping terrorism. Well, there's a really easy way: stop participating in it. He's pointed out that Obama's secret drone program is in fact the most extreme terrorist campaign of modern times. Obama has killed more than 6,000 people, including U.S. citizens and hundreds of children. The New York Times says that Obama chooses the targets himself from lists prepared by the CIA, and his drone assassinations continue today. Remarkably enough, President Obama has managed to hide much of his terrorism from the American people, or at least distract them from it, although the rest of the world recognizes it. President Obama says he's fighting terrorism, but in fact he's creating terrorists. He has attacked 8 countries, 2 more than President Bush, and he directs a private presidential army called Special Operations Forces of more than 70,000 people, larger than the militaries of many countries, active in more than 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. Today, the Obama administration is conducting wars throughout the Mideast, acting with belligerence towards China, and promoting an ongoing proxy war against Russia and Ukraine that has already killed more people than America's client Israel killed in Gaza in 2014. We must demand of Obama and his successor, probably Clinton, that they, 1, end the drone assassinations, 2, bring all U.S. troops and mercenaries home, 3, close the 1,000 foreign U.S. bases in the Mideast and elsewhere, no other country has more than 12, end the provocations of Russia and Ukraine and of China in the South China Sea, end support for Israel's apartheid policy, and finally, support negotiations among the U.S., Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and the Kurds to end the Syrian and Iraqi civil wars. In a book on the last presidential campaign, President Obama is quoted as follows: "Turns out I'm really good at killing people," Obama said quietly. "Didn't know that was going to be a strong suit of mine." That's from the book Double Down, Game Change 2012 by Mark Halperin and John Heilemann. However, ironically, Obama meant the comment. It's not been denied by the White House, and it turns out to be true. There's a lot of news about U.S. government war-making this week, but you won't hear much of it in the American media. That's Obama's great triumph in some ways. We'll mention some of it tonight, beginning with Ron Zoe.
Yes, I want to express some concern about the way things are going in Europe, especially. We know about repressive measures and the loss of civil liberties in the USA, all in the name of national security, and we're becoming more and more subjugated by the national security state. But I want to mention what is happening there to some extent due to the refugee crisis in Europe, and I suppose, and the rightward movement that I see in a number of places there. Egypt, which has not had a refugee crisis, but is becoming more and more repressive, apparently. Poland, surprisingly. I have before me here a piece from Al Jazeera. Poland, the European Union's media freedom conundrum. Since Poland's right-wing Law and Justice Party won the country's parliamentary elections in October, the media landscape has been undergoing a series of transformations. The party, led by Yaroslav Kaczynski, is anti-Russian, distrustful of Germany, and suspicious of immigrants. And with its strong emphasis on what it calls traditional Polish values, the government clearly wants domestic media organizations to get behind its nationalist message. So the government has made changes in the public broadcasting law in Poland, passing a media law that gives the government the power to directly appoint the heads of the Polish public broadcaster and other state-owned media outlets. The EU, European Union, has complained, but the EU, this says, has very little influence on the similar turn of events. In Hungary, where Viktor Orban's Fidesz party has reshaped the country's media in its own ultra-conservative image. So is there any reason to believe that things will turn out differently in Poland? Well, Poland, Hungary, and Turkey seem to be all becoming more and more authoritarian and nationalist and more and more repressive and inclined to ignore civil liberties. So I'll go on to mention another country that seems to be joining this trend, which is Israel, and which is frequently a trouble spot in this area, although they keep advertising themselves as the only democracy in the Middle East, but a lot of qualifications are in order on that point, I think. Israel has declared that the Swedish foreign minister is persona non grata in Israel. Headline: Israel Swedish foreign minister not welcome after calling for a probe. Associated Press, January 13th. Israel says Sweden's foreign minister is not welcome in the country after she called for an investigation into the deaths of Palestinians involved in a 4-month spate of deadly attacks on Israeli troops and civilians. Foreign Minister ministry spokesman said Wednesday that given the incendiary and aggressive nature of Margot Wallström's comments, we have made it clear that she is not welcome in Israel. Next item in the under the same rubric from J Street: Israeli cabinet undermines democracy with vote on anti-non-governmental organizations bill, the NGOs. J Street, which is a Jewish organization in Washington, D.C., is deeply concerned and disappointed by the Israeli cabinet's decision Sunday to send to the Knesset an approval of a one-sided bill aimed at restricting the work of progressive non-governmental organizations which monitor human rights and oppose the occupation. This move is a blow to Israel's most precious asset, its democracy, and undermines the fundamental democratic principles of freedom of expression and association enshrined in Israel's Declaration of Independence. Should the bill become law, it will damage the country and country's international standing and drive a wedge between many Jews living in the U.S. and elsewhere and Israelis. So next item from Agence France Presse, which often publishes things that will not appear in the American media. The U.S. concerned over Israel bill on foreign-backed NGOs. The U.S. ambassador to Israel expressed concern Monday over a draft bill that would toughen rules on foreign-backed NGOs, which rights groups say is aimed at stifling government criticism. If the bill is passed, it will require Israeli NGOs, which get at least half their funds from foreign governments, to identify donors on their financial statements and in official statements to public bodies. So the picture there is that the peace organizations and civil liberties organizations in Israel are primarily funded by outsiders, do-good groups in the USA and perhaps elsewhere. But the nationalist groups, the right-wing groups, are funded by individuals, typically ultra-rich American billionaires, such as Sheldon Adelson, and they will not be touched by the bill. So it's an interesting asymmetry there. This says right-wing NGOs tend to be funded by private individuals, also often outside Israel, and so would not be subject to the restrictions. So it's not looking good, and I just want to record a protest, a complaint against this, and to mention a couple of hopeful signs, one of which, of course, is the implementation day for the Iran policy, when it was made official that Iran is giving up a good deal of its potential nuclear capability, and to take note that this seems to be a contribution to peace, but all the Republican senators voted against the agreement that made it possible and probably prevented a big Middle Eastern war. So with that, I'll stop. There are a lot of other points that I may make later, but maybe we'll come back to that.
There are indeed. There's much more to be said on all of this. You're watching Aware on the Air. We'll go to Karen Aram.
Okay, I do have a lot of comments to make. I hope I don't forget them, Ron, when we get back to it. Okay, pivot to Asia. I didn't bring my notes, but just off the top of my head, I just want to mention a couple things. One, as far as most of our Asian nations in the Southeast Asia region, most of them are turning towards the West. Okay, this is coming out from some of the left articles that I've been reading. They are turning towards the West as opposed to China. Now, I will get back to that in a moment. But, I mean, I want to use as an example Taiwan, okay? Taiwan just had the recent elections, and their new president and prime minister is a woman, big deal. Basically, and I don't remember her name. I think her last name is Wen, W-E-N. She is and she had a strong majority. In the election, basically she supports Taiwanese independence. Now, do they think that she will actually push for that? Doubtful, doubtful. But the problem is that it means it will be a little more strife in relation to relations between Taiwan and China, at least on a political front. As I pointed out in the past, there's a lot of business going on between the two. But that's one of the reasons why Xi Jinping had been there in December visiting in hopes of showing his support and propping up the party that was the candidate who was being represented by the Kuomintang party, which to a lot of us with thinking of Taiwan from the past, we find it surprising that it's the party of the Kuomintang that actually is the party that is more supportive of reunification with China. Okay, then we have Indonesia, we have India, we have, the Philippines, of course. And the Philippines just had a trial whereby, and this was also interesting, it was actually one of the communist parties of the Philippines who brought to trial the issue of support for U.S. bases being there in the Philippines, the Subic Bay, Clark Air Force Base, et cetera, in order to project against China, okay? Which is interesting because you wouldn't expect that, but that's the case. They actually support the conservative government there. And they won the case, so now it's legitimate that the U.S. can reopen their bases in the Philippines. Second, let's see, let me go to Indonesia. I want to comment on something that I talked about almost, I don't know whether it was a year ago, last summer, when Alan Nairn, who is a highly credible American journalist. He was imprisoned previously by the Indonesian government for speaking out against the military regime, specifically General Prabowo, who had been running in the election there. Now Prabowo lost the election to Widodo, who is supposedly, moving more towards the West in their relations. But at the time, I was kind of shocked because Alan Nairn was interviewed by Democracy Now! That morning and said that he had been called to the residence of General Prabowo, and Prabowo was saying that, yes, he should be tried for crimes against humanity and genocide of his own people. And it was quite shocking. Alan Nairn was shocked, Amy Goodman was shocked, I was shocked. I used that word like 4 times in my discussion at the time. Well, now I can't find anything about it at all. And I have searched, believe me, to see if anything ever took place. So to me, it's an obvious setup by Prabowo because he really hates Alan Nairn. So there was never any trial of Prabowo unless somehow it's buried someplace. Let me see, what other nations could we talk about? Anyway, any event, what I want to read here, though, and I apologize for having to read this, but I fear I must. I cannot do justice to Pepe Escobar on my own. I mean, there's a lot going on throughout these nations, whether it's Burma, whether it's Malaysia, whether it's China or Hong Kong. There are so many little things, but I try to look at what is the most important thing as far as the future and peace versus anti-war. Okay. Pepe starts out in this article, and this is his Empire of Chaos, which refers to the U.S., preparing for more fireworks in 2016. So this is his New Year's article. He quotes, he says, in his seminal Fall of Rome and the End of Civilization, Brian Ward Perkins writes, Romans before the fall were as certain as we are today that their world would continue forever. And they were wrong. We would be wise not to repeat their complacency. The U.S. today is not about complacency. It's about hubris and fear. And he goes on to talk about Russian President Putin diplomatically insists on treating the West as partners. But he knows, and those in the know in China also know, these are not really partners. not after NATO's 78-day bombing, and then he goes on, he goes through the past of Belgrade in 1999, etc. Not after nonstop NATO expansionism, not after a second Kosovo in the form of an illegal coup in Kiev, not after the crashing of the oil price by Gulf petrodollar U.S. clients, not after the Wall Street engineered crashing of the ruble, not after U.S. and EU sanctions, not after the smashing of Chinese A shares by U.S. proxies on Wall Street, not after nonstop saber rattling in the South China Sea. He also mentions not after the shooting down of the Su-24, of which I have no information or knowledge. Then he goes on, he says, as much as Cold War II remains in effect, we were and will remain just a threat away from nuclear war. Whatever happens in the so-called Syrian peace process, the proxy war between Washington and Moscow will continue. He says, hubristic U.S. think tank land can't see it any other way. So for exceptionalist neocons and neoliberal cons alike, the only digestible endgame is a partition of Syria, assuming that there is a peace process there. He says the Erdogan system would gobble up the north, Israel would gobble up the oil-rich Golan Heights, and House of Saud proxies would gobble up the eastern desert. Russia literally bombed all these elaborate plans to ashes because the next step after partition would feature Ankara, Riyadh, and a leading from behind Washington, pushing a jihadi highway all the way north to the Caucasus, as well as Central Asia and Xinjiang, which is part of China. So when all else fails, nothing like a jihadi highway plunged as a dagger in the body of Eurasia integration. Now, in the Chinese front, whatever creative provocations the U.S. may come up with, they won't derail Beijing's aims in the South China Sea. That vast basin crammed with unexplored oil and gas wealth and prime naval highway to and from China. Beijing is inevitably configuring itself by 2020 as a formidable naval power. Washington may supply $250 million in military aid to Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia for the next 2 years. But that's mostly irrelevant. On the economic front, Washington-Beijing will remain prime proxy war territory. Washington pushes the TPP or NATO on trade pivoting to Asia. He said 12 member nations need to ratify it, not least the U.S. featuring an extremely hostile Congress. Now, against this American one-trick pony, Xi Jinping, for his part, is deploying a complex three-pronged strategy, China's own counterpunch to the TPP. That's the free trade area of the Asia-Pacific, the immensely ambitious One Belt, One Road, and the means to finance a tsunami of projects, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or the AIIB, the Chinese counterpunch to the World Bank, and the U.S.-Japan-controlled Asian Development Bank. So for Southeast Asia, for instance, the numbers tell the story. Last year, China was the top ASEAN partner to the tune of $367 billion. This will grow exponentially with One Belt, One Road, which will absorb $200 billion in Chinese investment up to 2018. Now, he also refers to the Heart of Darkness Revisited, which is the prospects for Europe, which are nothing but bleak, as you were reporting, Ron. So from the Ukraine to Syria and all across the Middle East to North Africa, the proxy war between Washington and Moscow, with higher and higher stakes, won't abate. Imperial despair over the irreversible Chinese ascent also won't abate. As the new great game picks up speed and Russia supplies Eurasian powers, Iran, China, and India with missile defense systems beyond anything the West has. Get used to the new normal, people. Cold War II between Washington and Beijing, Moscow.
I think that's unfortunately absolutely correct.
Yeah,
Thank you, Karen. You're watching Aware on the Air. We'll go around now with some questions about the things that have been said by the panelists so far. I want to start by asking both of my colleagues a question that grows out of a starting point that this evening, that Obama has a year left in office in which his peculiarly covert war on terrorism which has been so murderous around the world, will undoubtedly continue. But as I sat and listened, insofar as I could, to the Republican and Democratic debates in this last week, I began to wonder which of the candidates for president, from all parties, which of the candidates, if he or she becomes president, will kill more people. Clinton, Trump, Cruz, Sanders, Stein, which of those folks as president would kill the most people? Do you guys have a response to that?
Clinton.
Pardon?
Clinton.
That's
Sorry.
mine. That's my answer.
Yeah.
I think there's no contest. I mean, when
I
you put
wouldn't
it that way,
speculate
that's
on
true. Pardon?
I wouldn't speculate on that
Why not?
because there's no way of knowing whether you're even close to being right.
But speculating on it is exactly what we're going to do if we're being asked to vote for these people. I mean,
No, there's a host of other factors, but anyway.
a host of other factors.
Yes.
Well, that may be true, but the fact of the matter is, it's a question that I think has a fairly clear answer. And when I hear Donald Trump attacking the mess that was made in Iran and the mess that was made in Libya, when I hear Cruz, of all people, I mean, these are not attractive folks, eh? When I hear Cruz attacking the neocons and their desire for war, and when I hear Sanders being excoriated for not being very good on foreign policy, it seems to me that Karen's answer is precisely correct, that the best prognostication one could make right now from what we know of the politics of the parties and the characters of the nominees is that Clinton is the warmonger.
Now, can I explain myself?
Please.
Okay, yes, Clinton, based upon her experience as Secretary of State, she will continue the same policies that Obama began or continued, which were the same policies that the Bush administration had started. Except then when you start to read into it, and like I said, I want to mention the Imperial Brain Trust book by Lawrence Shoup and William Mintner. Now, this was published in 1977. It's the prelude to the recent book that I talked about, Lawrence Shoup having recently published, The Wall Street Think Tank. And basically, it deals with the Council on Foreign Relations and all the organizations and corporations within. They're over 5,000 members, all right? What I liked about this was it gives you the beginnings and the setup of the council after World War II. Actually, it started before World War II.
Yes, indeed.
And the goal, well, yeah, exactly. It started back, I think, the 20s, if I'm not mistaken, maybe even before that. Carl, you would know better than I, Ron, because you're a historian.
If you want to see that story, Google the phrase Grand Area Planning.
Okay, right.
Which was the phrase that was used before the Second World War by U.S.
Yes,
US
it
planners.
was.
Yeah.
Bottom line, it was started because they wanted to have what they called study groups, education. It was to educate the people, of course, on foreign policy as the corporations and the scholars who supported the same goals and ideals as they viewed America's situation going forward or our progress. One of the things that I think, Carl, I found very telling in this book is that it does point out how political activism during the 60s on the part of protesters and the Americans, along with, after the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, along with the fact that it became really obvious that we could not defeat Vietnam militarily. And so this was starting to have an impact on some of the members of the CFR. Now, George Ball had been opposed to the war and our means of controlling for quite some time. It wasn't publicized at the time. But he actually, along with, I think it was Morgenthau, Henry Morgenthau, if I'm not mistaken,
Possibly.
but along with others,
Yep.
they had a lot of meetings during the early Johnson administration. I say early, I mean, yeah, early. What they did was they actually came out then, and even George McBundy, who had been so pro-military, George McBundy actually came out and realized that this was a mistake. And when they approached Johnson, he was horrified. He was a hawk. They call him a deconstructed hawk. But he was kind of shocked because all along they had kept advising him to proceed militarily. And when they actually came out and had taken a complete turnabout, he was actually shocked by it. And according to the researchers, and these books by Lawrence Shoup and Minter, I mean, they are so detailed. What I like about this one in particular, it's actually shorter, briefer, because they put the footnotes after each chapter. So there aren't that many chapters, a lot of footnotes. So it does show how, of course, the American people can influence these advisors, but these advisors are the people who influence the administration. Kissinger, I didn't realize that. He was very influential going back to the late 50s. We didn't hear much about him back then. But he actually was, because he was writing some of the articles and the letters and the books. He was writing a lot on their behalf and conducting the study groups. So my point is that it doesn't really matter whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans. It doesn't matter who the individual is. Chances are we're going to get the same thing unless the American people stand up, convince, I say our leaders, convince the scholars, convince the corporations, good luck on that one, but convince those with the power to influence our government to stop the killing. I've come out recently in support of Bernie Sanders, in spite of the fact that I really support Jill Stein. But the reason I'm supporting Bernie now, I was actually influenced by Katrina vanden Heuvel when she was interviewed by Amy Goodman by one sentence. I have not read the article in The Nation, whereby The Nation supported Sanders. But Katrina got me with one sentence, and that was that Bernie will bring in new faces. Now, she didn't say who the faces were. I don't know if Bernie has even mentioned who those faces would be, but I thought to myself, well, that's refreshing. That might turn things around. Bernie is focusing on domestic policy, and I like everything I hear him saying. If it's possible, if he were to be elected, here's my thinking. Get him elected in the primaries. That would put Hillary out. One of two things could happen. One, the Democrats will not allow him to be their candidate. And I think because they want Hillary, I think the American people would then understand, the Democrats would then understand that, you know what? The Democratic Party is not utilizing the will of the people. Or he could actually run, and then let's see who he picks as his running mate. Jill Stein? Hey, I'd go for him in a heartbeat then. Or would he pick Hillary Clinton as his running mate? Well, there we are. I mean, I don't know. So that's why I'm saying Hillary is definitely out. But even to assume that a Donald Trump would back up his statements, again, you look at his background. As far as I'm concerned, Donald Trump is just a puppet to create more chaos, but domestic chaos. Yeah. He'll say anything, and it means nothing. That's my thinking on that. I'm sorry.
I'm very concerned about Hillary also. Some say she's overcompensating and trying to show that she has, bigger testicles than any man. But
well, who cares why she did what she did? We know that she's responsible for the deaths of many people, right? I don't care what her motivation
that's
was.
An overstatement, but
I don't think so.
Okay.
Libya, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
She was Secretary of State.
Yeah. Well, many people are responsible for it.
Right. Oh, exactly.
See,
that's my point too, Ron.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah.
We only elect one as president, though, right?
Yeah.
I mean, she was trying to show that she was as tough as a man,
Yeah.
but now she's doing the opposite. She's going to the left,
Yeah.
and she's taking on leftist policies. And I heard that this morning by somebody saying that she's becoming more of a leftist now. And I liked what our Karen Medina Levy said the other day at the Green Party meeting. She said, yeah, for what, 1 month? I mean,
right,
come on.
I think that's right. You're watching Aware on the Air. It's Ron's turn for a question or comment on what we've said so far.
Well, I'm not keeping up with the Asian situation as much as you are, Karen, but where do you see the principal challenges to peace there now? I mean, is it coming from Indonesia or
No.
Burma or
No.
what?
Well, it's coming from the U.S. creating
Yeah.
hostility
Right,
and provoking China.
Right.
And the U.S. is behind each and every one of these nations,
Yeah.
giving them money and remilitarizing them. We know that Vietnam has accelerated their military buildup. We know that Japan has built up their military. They remilitarized. So we see this happening all around Asia. Indonesia, India, all of them are going towards the West, and they're getting money from the West. But at the end of the day, I've been saying all along, there is so much interconnecting of business interests between China. They are all dependent upon China for business, okay? And then when Pepe comes out and makes the statement, and he didn't go into the details, he just said, you know, it doesn't matter. They'll take the money from the U.S. It's rather like what Legacy of Ashes pointed out about the Thai generals in Thailand back in the 60s, taking all this money that the U.S. was throwing at them from the U.S. Embassy in order to create a veneer of democracy. And when it completely failed, and you know they were called on the carpet by the U.S. Embassy, their answer was simply that, oh, well, you know, all this democracy thing sounds really nice, but it won't work here. And that's exactly what these Asian nations are going to do in the end, because they know what we do. They know what the U.S. is responsible for. And I mean, all we have to do is go back through our history. Look at how we've propped up dictators, whether it's the Middle East, whether it's in Latin America. Oh, one point I do need to make, thank you, I forgot to mention, and this is very important, is that now the pivot to Asia, the Pentagon is turning that to Latin America because of China. And they're actually going to start sending in, well, military advisors, some they've already done, and they're going to start sending in military. We're going to have a bigger military presence, which is really frightening when you know our history in Latin America, because specifically Nicaragua, specifically I think Colombia, those nations that are building their infrastructure up with the Chinese. So that is rather frightening, and that's really where we're turning our pivot to. So,
If I were to address Ron's question, it would seem to me that the greatest threat to peace in Asia is the Obama administration's desire to continue the great American tradition of trying to control the Asian economy. It goes back really to the 19th century. But the crowning point of the Obama presidency, the neoliberal triumph that Obama wants to be the end of his presidency, the end in the sense of goal, are the trade pacts, most notably the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But we should not ignore the Transatlantic Investment and Trade and Investment Partnership. The TPP for Pacific and the TTIP for the Atlantic, for Europe, are essentially attempts to the United States to set up new contractual agreements that deliver the control of the economies of these regions into the hands of American business. In a sense, of course, that's where they've been, at least since the Second World War, and in some ways since the open door to China more than a century ago. But the Obama administration, as part of the neoliberal campaign, which is really a resurgence of capitalist control over the last generation or so, wants to put these into law. And the interesting thing is that they're having such trouble doing it. The opposition, even in this country, to these grabs for power by American business is pretty widespread. It's not a foregone conclusion that Obama will get his Trans-Pacific Partnership or his Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, but he might. And in fact, if I had to bet it right now, I would bet it. I would use the same sort of odds that Hillary will win in Iowa. You know that for all the challenges, that looks like the surer bet. Now, if we want to talk about what the real threat to peace in the Pacific and in some ways in Europe is, it seems to me it's those neoliberal policies of the U.S. government at the moment. Ron mentioned earlier the rightist turn in Eastern Europe, notably Poland. And I want to suggest that one of the things that's at stake here is the growth of authoritarianism in response to economic distress.
Yes.
I mean, we're at the end of a generation almost now of European austerity, certainly since the 2008 crisis. But austerity has been the response of European states, and indeed the U.S. too. We don't use the word here, but the Obama administration has clearly been an administration of austerity, and the economic depredations of Obama's austerity are, as usual in Obama's world, covert. Most people know how bad their own economic situation is, but we don't have a common consciousness in this country of a generally bad economic situation. There is such a common consciousness in Poland and in Eastern Europe and in other parts of the fringes of Europe, if you like, and even at the heart of Europe, in Germany, most notably. And the move towards authoritarianism as a response to that is not historically unprecedented. That's what happened after the First World War.
Right.
Economic distress, the Great Depression, leads to authoritarianism. We need a man on horseback, or maybe even a woman on horseback. We need someone strong to take control of this and to drive out those foreigners who are screwing up our economic situation and put this country back on its, make America great again, right? And make America great means that we have an economic situation that improves the present situation. This is a very dangerous trend. It's a very deep trend, and I think it's actually it's what's going on in Poland and in some peculiar ways in the United States as well.
Yeah, even in Ukraine, where for a long time there's not much nationalist consciousness, but they've been trying to promote patriotism and what's sometimes called citizenship education in the schools and so on, and make them aware that they're Ukrainians as distinct from and usually opposed to Russians. And it's been very divisive in Ukraine because the two easternmost provinces of Ukraine are strongly pro-Russian. They speak Russian and they look to Russia for economic and historical and cultural reasons. So,
Are you referring to Crimea as one of those?
yes, well, no, I'm talking about the Donbass region.
Right.
Yeah, but you could include the Ukraine in that
Right.
also.
The lesson of the first half of the 20th century was that fascism in Italy and Germany arose as a patriotic movement.
Yes.
It was a patriotic movement occasioned by economic distress.
Yeah.
And when we see patriotic movements occasioned by economic distress in the U.S. and Europe, we should be properly worried.
One point, one positive point is that I do watch RT, and as a result, I have seen where Pegida, the far-right organization in Germany, when they came out they came out and had a lot of demonstrations anti the refugees, quite virulent about that. There were something like thousands of protesters who were organized against Pegida, but also very pro-refugees. So I want to emphasize that these organizations and governments don't necessarily represent the full population of the people any more than these right-wingers who are supporting Trump, when he is so anti-refugees, anti-immigrants, wants to push them all back, and he makes these statements, does not necessarily represent the American people either. So.
You're watching Aware on the Air. We're ranging over a number of issues here. I'd like to pose another one to my colleagues. What do you make of the Iran deal and the state of the Iran deal today? Is this a splendid triumph for the Obama administration, or is it a craven capitulation to the forces of international evil?
What if it's neither one?
Well, that's what.
What if it's
So
both?
tell me about it.
What if it's
What is
both?
it? What is it if you think it's neither one?
Well, it's a step, maybe a small one, toward coexistence and avoiding another war in the Middle East, which I don't think we need. But I was happy to see it happen, and I think Obama and Kerry should get some credit for it, although I know that will immediately be attacked. But anyway, they are, according to some sources, completely incapable of doing anything positive.
I give them credit for it.
Yes.
I say give credit where credit's due. Whatever their motivations, which, yeah, we know that their motivation is not purely about peace, but a need to, I mean, hey, Iran has a lot of oil, folks, okay? And Iran is practically the largest nation.
It's a big danger because the oil prices are so low.
Right, but
Yeah.
It will bring even
Right.
more oil
Exactly.
onto the market.
right, that's true. But still, all our major concern is one, keeping oil out of Asia, keeping the prices low, and making sure that we control it. I mean, one thing we all have to recognize is that with the U.S. and with the scholars and the corporations and the people, they're not really just thinking short term. I always criticize American corporations specifically for thinking about short-term profits. But at least there has been a lot of planning going on, going back to before World War II, in respect to domination and control of the resources throughout the Middle East and Asia. So I think, and again, I agree, it's a move in the right direction for peace. Never mind, Saudi Arabia doesn't like it, and Israel doesn't like it, and that alone should tell us something. So, I think it's, and so I give credit there. Now, what do you think about the fact that we waited less than 24 hours and suddenly we reimposed more sanctions,
Yeah.
less harmful sanctions?
Yes, yes.
So,
Good
so
point.
they're minimal. That's okay. I guess. I mean, they're not going to starve the people, prevent medicines to getting to the civilian population. The things that we've been doing to Iran,
As we've done before, right?
Yes, and the release of their funds, of their monies that they have made from their sale of oil, that we have been controlling. So
Yeah, that's another element in there. The lower oil prices can be viewed as, to some extent, an attack on Russia.
Absolutely.
oh, it is.
That's
yes.
right.
Pepe mentions that right here. I mean, that's exactly.
And
yeah.
incidentally, on Venezuela and some other people were
Yes.
not the U.S.
Right.
is worried about. So it's I think that's an extremely important point.
Right.
We remember that the notion that the U.S. government is working for American business is obvious and certainly true. But that the policies that grow out of that are clear is not true. That it takes some effort, even discussions at the
Right.
Council of Foreign Relations, to figure out what works.
Yes.
As the old man in the British Museum said 150 years ago, under capitalism, the government is the executive committee of the bourgeoisie. Now, the job of the executive committee is to balance the various interests in it. For example, although it is true to say that in a sense the U.S. invasion of Iraq was a war for oil, the U.S. major oil companies were not really in support of that invasion, because they figured that at least in the short term, it would disrupt the arrangements they had for extracting Middle East oil. And they were right, of course it did. Now, the notion that in the long term it enhanced American control of the world oil market is certainly true, and that was the real reason the American government wanted to do it. But we were perfectly willing to kill 1 million people in order to make sure that the U.S. controlled world energy flows. But the idea that everybody should be down with the program is not true. And that's true right now, I think, on the issue of the real reason the U.S. is reincorporating Iran into what Henry Kissinger called the overall framework of order is to maintain that general control. But there are people along the way who are not particularly happy with that, notably the Saudis. The U.S. has reason to want to discipline the Saudis a bit anyhow. The Saudis do have that distressing tendency to finance jihadists that we don't want to finance right now in various parts of the Middle East. The U.S. has traditionally used jihadists for its own purposes and is doing so now, today, in Syria. But the problem of a godfather running various capos, some of the capos sometimes get out of hand. And it sort of looks like the Saudis have overplayed their role. The U.S. probably was interested in encouraging a run-up in the price of oil for just the reasons Ron suggests, but the Saudis have got the bit in their teeth, and they have to be disciplined a little. We have that problem occasionally with our other clients in the region, notably Israel. It's a specific issue regarding Iran and oil. The U.S. was never concerned about an Iranian nuclear weapon. The U.S. was very much concerned about whether Iran should be cooperative, be a capo as it once was, or whether it would be obstructive to the U.S. control of the region and, in larger terms, its control of Eurasia. So in that sense, the Iran deal is perfectly traditional American foreign policy, as Karen was describing it. But the upshot is better than the opposite, as Ron says. I think that's right.
Carl, I'm not sure what the price of oil per barrel is now at the moment, but I know that according to RT, the planning and the budget that Saudi did last year or sometime during the end of the year had it based upon $29 a barrel.
Right.
It's about 39.
It's 30, right.
30 now,
Right.
sinking to 25.
Okay.
It slipped under
Okay.
30, right?
But they planned on it. So there's no question that they're involved in the planning and that we've overproduced. But one other comment I want to make here, and it can be clarified for me if I'm wrong. My impression is that the lobbyists represent many of the companies like Walmart, the Koch brothers, which is very, very wide, a very broad range of companies. They're the ones that buy off our Congress, okay? And this is referred to in the CFR as some of the state power, I think, as where it's the think tanks that represent the major corporations, such as Lockheed Martin, such as all of the weapons manufacturers, when they're representing corporations. They're involved in influencing the administration. Now, so they do sometimes come into conflict. I mean, I think that it is deeper than just a mere, well, the Republican Congress won't do anything on behalf of Obama. I think that's true, but at the same time, I think it is much deeper and based more upon the various different interests. I don't know, maybe I'm viewing it a bit simplistically, but I think it is very complex. And that's why you do, some people would say, well, that's a good balance of powers. I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure when, I mean, it's the money. It's all about the money. If you don't have the money, forget your influence.
You got the money, you got the money.
Yeah, so we can't call ourselves a democracy if we can't influence our government.
If we have a little time left, I'd like to insert one more idea that I came across this week that hadn't really occurred to me by the writer on the history of religions, Philip Jenkins, in the American Conservative, January 13th. He talks about a retro map of the Middle East and the ancient battleground of Al Jazeera, not to be confused with Al Jazeera, the media company, but Al Jazeera, which means the island between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, corresponding to Upper Mesopotamia. And he thinks a lot of Muslims are looking to that as their ancient homeland to be defended, and they want to carve it out of the Middle East, which now is a horrible, trouble-causing mix of arbitrary lines drawn after World War I without regard to ethnic and linguistic and religious sensitivities in the area. So it corresponds pretty much to Upper Mesopotamia, right up in here, and it's the former ancient Assyria, largely, and that is a big element in the thinking of those people. They will be demanding, the Muslims, or certain elements in them, will be demanding a homeland where they can be safe, I guess, which is what Islamic State seems to represent. So it's, in a way, it's a development parallel to Zionism and wanting a ethnically and religiously pure state where they can take refuge, and there's a possibility of a very troublesome parallelism there. So I think our Middle Eastern troubles are still going to go on for generations, perhaps, because Muslims are apparently much more aware of this than most Americans are.
Sounds like Islamophobia to me.
Yeah.
I think it's very.
I think it's
Jenkins-
real,
yeah.
but only of certain select groups
Yeah. Well.
that are suffering from a lot of what we've
Yeah.
been doing to them.
Yeah.
We'll
that
post. We'll post Jenkins' article on the Aware Aware Facebook page if you want to look at this. It's an interesting and I think important notion. Other things, other people said some interesting things in the Middle East this week. The American ambassador to Israel is Dan Shapiro, who grew up here in Champaign.
Oh, really?
And his father's on the faculty at the little university down the street. Dan this week said that Israel has a legal double standard in the West Bank. That's a synonym for apartheid. He criticized Israeli apartheid in the West Bank. And as Haaretz, the liberal Israeli paper, says, Shapiro voices sharp criticism of Israeli authorities, saying, quote, too much Israeli vigilantism in the West Bank goes on unchecked, close quote. And the Prime Minister's office, Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel was suitably shocked, condemned Dan Shapiro, condemned the American ambassador for his comments, and even Haaretz calls Shapiro remarks nearly unprecedented criticism against the Israeli government. So very interesting and good for Dan. I'm very glad to hear it. There are other things this week. We will put some notes, as I say, to the sorts of things that we've been talking about on the Aware Facebook page. You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the third week of 2016. Another week in which the Obama administration's drone assassination program is paralleled by overwhelming police killings in the U.S., far beyond what happens in other countries. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett. Thanks to him also, this program and others like it will be available on YouTube. And see, as I say, the Facebook page for Aware. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others who are being persecuted by the Obama administration. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Ron Zoke, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, Karen Aram, Michael Bay, David Johnson, David Green, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.